The bill of sale didn't list her name. It just read, "One woman, able-bodied, for the sum of $40 and a mule." At 19, Mabel knew exactly what she was worth to her stepmother. She was too heavy to marry off to the local boys, too expensive to feed through another brutal winter. So, Agatha sold her to a stranger from the high ridges. Mabel expected cruelty. She expected the worst. She never expected him. Agatha licked her thumb. The sound of dry skin rasping against paper seemed louder than the wind rattling the porch boards. $40 in crumpled greenbacks. She counted them twice, her sharp, bird-like eyes darting between the money and the massive man standing in her dirt yard. Mabel stood off to the side, her hands folded over her stomach. She wore her only good dress, a dark brown wool that trapped the late autumn heat and made the sweat pool between her shoulder blades. She took up too much space on the narrow porch. She always took up too much space. In a frontier town where women were expected to be frail, delicate things needing protection, Mabel was built like a root-cellar door. Broad-shouldered, thick-waisted, and heavy. The boys in Oak Haven used to throw pine cones at her when she walked to the mercantile, calling her the winter sow. "She eats a lot," Agatha said, pocketing the bills. Her voice was flat, devoid of any maternal affection. "But she's strong, can haul water, chop wood if she has to, never complains much." The man grunted. His name was Caleb. That was all Mabel knew. He smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a faint metallic tang of dried blood. He wore a heavy buffalo coat despite the lingering heat of the sun, and a dark beard obscured most of his face. The visible skin was tanned to the texture of a saddle. He didn't look at Mabel with the sneering disgust of the town boys, nor did he look at her with the predatory gleam she had learned to fear from passing drifters. He looked at her the same way he had looked at the sway-backed mule Agatha had thrown into the bargain, assessing, calculating. "She'll do," Caleb said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. He turned on his heel. He didn't offer a hand, didn't utter a word of comfort. He just grabbed the mule's lead rope and started walking toward the timberline. "Get your box, Mabel," Agatha snapped, already turning back toward the screen door. "And don't come back down that mountain. I ain't giving him his money back." The door slammed. The latch clicked. Mabel stared at the peeling white paint of the door for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury afforded to girls who had mothers to wipe them away. She walked down the steps, her heavy boots sinking into the dry dust. She hoisted her wooden trunk by the leather handle. It was heavy, packed with a few quilts, 2 spare dresses, and a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her real mother. She hauled it over to the mule, strapping it awkwardly to the pack saddle. Caleb had stopped a few yards ahead, waiting, but he didn't offer to help. The hike up the mountain was a brutal, lung-burning endurance test. The elevation climbed sharply just a mile outside of Oak Haven. The air grew thinner, biting at the back of Mabel's throat. Dust coated her tongue. Her thighs chafed violently beneath the heavy wool skirt, a familiar, agonizing friction that made every step a concentrated effort of will. $40. The thought kept rhythm with her boots hitting the rocky trail. $40. It wasn't a small amount of money, but it wasn't a fortune either. It was the price of a decent rifle, a winter's worth of flour and salt pork. It was the exact numerical value of her existence. Caleb walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging slightly, but he set a grueling pace. He moved through the brush with the quiet efficiency of an animal born to the high country. For hours, the only sounds were the clopping of the mule's hooves, the wind shifting through the ponderosa pines, and Mabel's ragged, heavy breathing. By mid-afternoon, her vision started to blur at the edges. Her chest heaved. The corset Agatha had forced her to wear, a futile attempt to strap her flesh into an acceptable shape, dug viciously into her ribs. She stumbled on a loose piece of shale, dropping to one knee. The sharp rock sliced through her skirt, tearing the fabric and biting into the flesh beneath. She gasped, catching her weight on her hands. Ahead of her, the footsteps stopped. Caleb turned. He watched her for a long moment from beneath the brim of his battered hat. Mabel braced herself for the reprimand. She waited for him to call her useless, to tell her she was too fat to make the climb, to threaten her with the back of his hand. Instead, Caleb walked back down the trail. He untied a tin canteen from his belt and held it out. "Drink," he said. Mabel stared at the canteen. Her hands were shaking. She reached out, her thick, calloused fingers brushing against his leather gloves. She uncorked it and drank. The water was icy cold, tasting of tin and mountain streams. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Pace yourself," Caleb told her, his tone completely neutral. "Air gets thin up here. No sense killing yourself on the first day." He didn't mention her weight. He didn't look at her torn skirt. He just waited until she had her fill, took the canteen back, and turned around. "We got another 4 miles before sundown," he said over his shoulder. Mabel pushed herself up from the dirt. Her knee throbbed, and her lungs still burned, but the tight, suffocating knot of panic in her chest loosened just a fraction. She wiped the dust from her mouth with the back of her hand and followed him up into the tree line. The sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a bruised, freezing twilight by the time they reached the clearing. The cabin sat tucked against a sheer wall of granite, shielded from the prevailing winds. It was a crude structure of peeled logs and chinking, flanked by a woodshed and a small meat smoker. Caleb tied the mule to a post and began unstrapping the packs. Mabel stood in the center of the clearing, the sudden drop in temperature biting right through her wool dress. The silence here was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, vastly different from the rustling, gossiping noise of Oakhaven. Here, there was only the wind and the rock. "Go inside," Caleb ordered, lifting her wooden trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Fire's laid in the stove. Just needs a match." Mabel pushed open the heavy plank door. The inside of the cabin was pitch black and smelled overwhelmingly of old grease, pine resin, and unwashed man. She fumbled in the dark, her hand scraping against a rough-hewn table until she found a tin box of lucifers. She struck one. The sudden flare of sulfur illuminated a small, sparse room. There was a cast-iron stove in the corner, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, shelves lined with tin cans and jars, and a single bed shoved against the far wall. The bed was draped in thick animal pelts. Mabel lit the kerosene lantern on the table, then moved to the stove. She was a master at coaxing fires to life. Within minutes, the dry kindling was crackling, and a meager warmth began to radiate through the freezing room. Caleb stepped inside, bringing the smell of the cold with him. He dropped her trunk at the foot of the bed. He shut the door, threw the heavy wooden bolt, and took off his hat. Without the shadow of the brim, Mabel finally saw his face clearly in the lantern light. A thick, raised scar cut diagonally from his left cheekbone down into his beard, pulling the corner of his eye downward in a permanent, slight squint. He looked older than she had guessed, early 40s maybe, exhausted. He didn't say a word to her. He walked to a wash basin, cracked the thin layer of ice that had formed over the water, and began scrubbing his hands with a piece of lye soap. Mabel stood frozen by the stove. The reality of her situation came crashing down on her, heavy and suffocating. She was 19. She was entirely alone, miles from civilization, locked in a single room with a man who had bought her. She knew what men wanted. Agatha had been brutally explicit about a wife's duties, painting a grim picture of painful, humiliating submission. Mabel gripped the edge of the stove, the cast iron biting into her palms. She waited for him to turn around. She waited for the demands. Caleb finished washing. He dried his hands on a filthy towel, then walked over to the shelves. He pulled down a sack of coffee beans, a hand grinder, and a chunk of salted beef. He set them on the table. "I can't work the grinder no more," Caleb said, his voice flat. He held up his right hand. Mabel blinked. In the flickering light, she saw that his hand was a mangled ruin. The index and middle fingers were missing at the second knuckle, and the remaining joints were thick, swollen, and twisted with what looked like severe, untreated breaks that had healed badly. "Bear trap," he said, catching her stare. He dropped his hand. 3 winters ago, left legs chewed up too, makes chopping wood slow, makes skinning out an elk damn near impossible when the cold sets into the joints." He pushed the grinder and the bag of beans across the table toward her. "I need someone to grind the coffee, skin the meat, chop the kindling." He looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away the layers of her anxiety. "I didn't buy a wife, girl. I bought a set of hands. Because if I don't get help, I'm going to freeze or starve to death before April." Mabel stared at him. The sheer, unromantic pragmatism of it stunned her. She wasn't a prize. She wasn't a victim of some dark, lustful fantasy. She was a farm implement, a tool to keep him alive. It was the most relieving thing anyone had ever said to her. She moved to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. She poured the dark, oily beans into the hopper and began to turn the crank. The grinding noise filled the cabin, loud and steady. Caleb took a hunting knife and began clumsily hacking at the salted beef with his good hand, throwing the chunks into an iron pot. When they ate in silence. The beef was tough and entirely unseasoned, but the coffee was strong and hot. Mabel ate every scrap on her tin plate. Back home, Agatha would have slapped her wrist for eating so much, telling her she was eating them into the poorhouse. Caleb didn't even look up. He just nudged the remaining piece of beef in the center of the pot toward her side of the table with the blade of his knife. When the meal was done, Mabel stood to clear the plates. She washed them in the freezing basin water, her mind racing. "Bed's yours," Caleb said. Mabel turned. Caleb was dragging a thick bearskin rug toward the hearth. He tossed a wool blanket over it and sat down, leaning his back against the stone chimney. "Mr. Caleb," Mabel started, her voice thick and hesitant. It was the first time she had spoken since they left town. "Just Caleb," he muttered, pulling his boots off. "I can sleep on the floor. I'm used to it. The bed is yours." Caleb stopped. He looked up at her. He took in her broad frame, the sturdy, solid mass of her. "I sleep on the floor because the heat from the stone is the only thing that keeps my back from locking up by morning," he said. "Take the bed. You're going to need your rest. Tomorrow, we chop a cord of wood." He lay down, pulling the blanket up over his shoulders, and turned his face to the fire. Mabel stood in the middle of the room for a long time. She walked over to the bed. She didn't take off her clothes, only her boots. She crawled beneath the heavy furs. The mattress was stuffed with pine needles and smelled of the forest. She lay awake listening to the wind howling against the cabin walls and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the stranger on the floor. For the first time in 19 years, she wasn't someone's burden. She was someone's survival. And as the firelight danced across the rough log ceiling, Mabel realized she might actually like it here. Morning arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but with a brittle gray light that seeped through the cracks in the chinking. Mabel woke to the sound of metal scraping against metal. She sat up, the cold air immediately biting at her exposed neck. Caleb was already dressed, standing by the stove, clumsily trying to strike a match with his mangled right hand. Mabel threw off the furs. She didn't hesitate. She walked over, gently took the matchbook from his stiff fingers, and struck the lucifer against the iron stove. The flame flared. She touched it to the oil-soaked kindling. "Coffee's ground," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. Caleb merely nodded, pulling his collar up around his neck. "Get your boots on. Daylight burns fast up here." Breakfast was black coffee and a hardened biscuit that tasted faintly of ash. By the time the sun fully breached the ridge, they were outside. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the unmistakable scent of incoming snow. A massive pile of unsplit logs sat beside the woodshed. Lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, thick and stubborn. Caleb handed her a splitting maul. The handle was smooth hickory, worn dark by years of sweat. The iron head was heavy, a brutal wedge of metal. "Watch your shins," he grunted, limping over to a chopping block. He took a lighter axe, favoring his bad leg as he began to limb a smaller branch. Mabel stood before a massive round of pine. Back in Oakhaven, the town girls would faint at the sight of a woodpile this size. They spent their days embroidering and complaining about the summer heat. Mabel gripped the hickory handle. She spread her stance, planting her heavy boots firmly in the frozen dirt. She raised the maul over her head. Her weight had always been her greatest shame. Agatha had made sure of that, constantly reminding her of the extra fabric needed for her dresses, the sheer space she occupied in a room. But as Mabel swung the maul down, she let gravity in her own mass do the work. The iron head struck the wood with a deafening crack. The pine split clean in two, the halves falling away into the dirt. She didn't stop. She set up another round, swung, cracked, set up another. The physical labor was relentless, but there was a deep, primal satisfaction in it. The heavy wool of her dress grew damp with sweat. Her shoulders burned, a dull, spreading ache that radiated down her spine. Yet, the pile of split wood grew. She found a rhythm. Lift, drop, split. Lift, drop, split. She was a machine fueled by years of repressed anger and the sudden, liberating realization that she was finally useful. An hour passed, then 2. Caleb stopped his own work and leaned against the shed, watching her. He rolled a cigarette with his good hand, lighting it and taking a slow drag. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't tell her she was strong for a woman. He just watched the woodpile grow. "Take a break," he he called out eventually. Mabel let the maul rest against the chopping block. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving. She wiped a mixture of sweat and sawdust from her forehead. "I'm not tired," she lied. Her forearms were trembling. "I didn't say you were," Caleb replied, pushing off the shed wall. "But you break a handle swinging when your arms are jelly. I don't have a spare. Go check the snares by the creek." He tossed her a burlap sack. The change of task was a mercy, though neither of them would admit it. Mabel took the sack and walked down the steep embankment toward the sound of rushing water. The creek was half frozen, sharp spears of ice clinging to the smooth river rocks. She found the snare line Caleb had pointed out. Most were empty, the wire loop swaying idly in the breeze. But the fourth snare held a fat snowshoe hare, its neck broken clean. Mabel didn't flinch. She had gutted chickens for Agatha since she was 6. She freed the hare, dropped it into the sack, and reset the wire. When she returned to the cabin, Caleb was filing a crosscut saw. He glanced at the blood on her hands and the bulge in the sack. "Good," he said. "Skin it. Save the pelt. Stew the rest." That afternoon set the pattern for the next 3 weeks. They worked in tandem, a silent partnership forged in the necessity of the coming winter. Mabel hauled water, chopped wood, ground coffee, and cooked. Caleb hunted, repaired the cabin's roof, and cured the meat in the smoker. They spoke little. Words were a waste of breath at this altitude. But in the silence, Mabel began to notice things. She noticed how Caleb always made sure her side of the stove was stoked before he went to sleep. She noticed that when he shot a deer, he gave her the best cut of the backstrap, taking the tough neck meat for himself. He never mentioned her size, except to hand her the heavier tasks with a matter-of-fact trust that made her chest swell with strange pride. One evening, as the wind began to howl a vicious warning against the logs, Mabel sat mending a tear in Caleb's heavy coat. He was sitting by the fire, whittling a new handle for a skinning knife. "Agatha said you'd likely work me to death," Mabel said softly, biting off the end of her thread. Caleb paused. He didn't look up from the wood. "Agatha's a fool who doesn't know the value of a good draft horse." It was a rough comparison. Brutal, even. But Mabel smiled. Down in the valley, they called her a pig. Up here, she was a workhorse. Essential. Powerful. She laid the coat on the table, the needlework sturdy and practical. The winter was coming, but for the first time in her life, Mabel felt ready for the cold. The snow didn't start as a gentle flurry. It hit the mountain like a physical blow. By mid-November, the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the wind shrieked through the pines with terrifying violence. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single afternoon. Mabel was at the woodpile when the first flakes, hard as rock salt, stung her cheeks. Caleb appeared at the cabin door, his face grim. "Inside," he barked. "Leave the rest. It's a whiteout." She grabbed an armful of split logs and hurried toward the door. By the time she crossed the 50 feet of yard, the cabin was barely visible through the swirling wall of white. Caleb slammed the heavy plank door shut behind her, throwing the bolt. The cabin instantly felt like a tomb. The wind battered the logs, a relentless, deafening roar that vibrated through the floorboards. Caleb moved quickly to the windows, bolting the heavy wooden shutters. They were trapped. For the first 2 days, the storm was merely a nuisance. They had enough wood stacked inside to keep the stove burning hot, and plenty of dried meat and beans. But on the third night, The true cost of the cold revealed itself. Mabel woke in the pitch black to a sound she had never heard before. A low, guttural groan of absolute agony. She threw off her furs and blindly felt her way to the lantern. Her fingers were numb, but she managed to strike a match. The yellow light flared, casting frantic shadows against the logs. Caleb was on the floor, curled into a tight ball. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He was clutching his left leg, his knuckles white. "Caleb?" Mabel dropped to her knees beside him. He didn't answer. His eyes were squeezed shut, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the freezing draft leaking under the door. The barometric pressure and the extreme cold had finally caught up to his ruined joints. Mabel didn't panic. Panic was for girls who expected someone else to fix things. She moved to the stove. The fire had died down to embers. She threw in 3 heavy rounds of pine, opening the draft wide until the flames roared to life. She grabbed the large iron kettle, filled it with water from the bucket, and slammed it onto the hottest part of the iron. She went to the shelves and rummaged through Caleb's sparse supplies until she found a tin of drawing salve and a bottle of cheap, potent whiskey. By the time the water was boiling, Caleb had stopped groaning, but his body was rigid, locked in a painful muscle spasm. Mabel tore an old flour sack into strips. She dipped them into the scalding water, wringing them out with her thick, calloused hands. The heat burned her palms, but she ignored it. She knelt beside him again. "I need to pull your trousers up," she said. Caleb grunted, a weak sound of assent. Mabel pushed the heavy wool fabric up past his knee. She gasped. The leg was a roadmap of violent trauma. Deep, puckered scars wrapped around his calf and thigh, the muscle tissue missing in large, concave chunks. The knee joint itself was swollen to the size of a melon, inflamed and radiating heat. The bear trap hadn't just broken bones, it had mangled the limb beyond proper repair. She laid the steaming cloths directly over the swollen joint. Caleb let out a sharp hiss, his body flinching, but then slowly, incrementally, the tension began to bleed out of his muscles. "Drink," Mabel said, uncorking the whiskey and holding it to his lips. He drank blindly, coughing as the cheap liquor burned down his throat. For the rest of the night, Mabel didn't sleep. She sat on the floor beside him, constantly swapping out the cold rags for boiling hot ones. She fed the fire. She rubbed the drawing salve into the ruined flesh of his right hand, kneading the stiff, twisted fingers with her strong thumbs until the joints loosened. Her back ached. Her knees were bruised from the hard floorboards, but she kept working. She poured her strength into him, using her mass and her endurance to fight off the freezing air that was trying to cripple him. Around dawn, the wind finally began to die down. The roaring outside faded to a low whistle. Caleb opened his eyes. The feverish glaze had left them. He looked at the ceiling, then slowly turned his head to look at Mabel. She was slumped against the chopping block they kept inside, a cooling wet rag still clutched in her hand. Her hair was a messy knot, her face smudged with soot. "You should be in the bed," he whispered, his voice cracking. Mabel opened one eye. "You needed the heat from the floor." Caleb slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows. The swelling in his leg had gone down significantly. He looked at his hand, flexing the remaining fingers. The stiffness was manageable. He looked back at her, a profound, unreadable expression on his scarred face. "I reckon you saved me a world of hurt, Mabel." It was the first time he had used her name. "I reckon you paid $40 for me," she replied, her tone dry. "Be ashamed to let your investment freeze to death." Caleb let out a short, rough bark of laughter. It was a rusty sound, like a gate hinge that hadn't been oiled in years. It changed his whole face, softening the harsh lines around his eyes. $40, he repeated, shaking his head slowly. He pulled himself up, leaning heavily against the stone chimney. "I robbed that woman blind." Mabel didn't say anything, but a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. Outside, the world was buried in 10 feet of snow, locked in ice and silence. But inside the cabin, the air was warm. They had survived the first strike of winter. And as Mabel hauled herself up to start grinding the morning coffee, she realized the crushing weight of her past was finally beginning to melt away. Winter broke in late April, not with a gentle yielding, but with a violent cracking of ice and the deafening roar of the swollen creek. The snowpack retreated, revealing black, sodden earth and the skeletal remains of the frozen brush. Mabel stood on the porch, holding a tin cup of black coffee. The air was still biting, but it smelled of mud and wet pine instead of sterile, endless frost. She took a deep breath, letting the raw wind fill her lungs. She had survived. She looked down at her hands. They were ruined by town standards, calloused, scarred from knife slips, and permanently stained with pine pitch and wood ash. She was still a heavy woman. The brutal labor hadn't stripped her bones bare, but the fat had shifted, layered over thick, dense muscle. Her shoulders were broader from swinging the maul. Her back was a wall of solid strength. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an oversized mistake. She felt like a mountain. Inside the cabin, the scrape of a chair leg against the floorboards signaled Caleb was up. His limp was always worse in the damp spring mornings, but he never complained. He just moved slower, favoring the ruined knee until the joints warmed. By noon, they were outside working on the roof, replacing cedar shakes that the winter storms had torn away. Mabel was on the ladder, her heavy boots planted firmly on the rungs, hauling up a bucket of wooden pegs. Caleb sat near the pitch of the roof, his scarred hands moving with practiced efficiency. The sound of hoofbeats broke the steady rhythm of the hammer. Mabel paused, squinting down the muddy trail. A man was riding a piebald horse into the clearing, leading a heavily loaded pack mule. He wore a greasy bowler hat and a canvas coat stained with years of dirt. "Emmett," Caleb said, his voice flat. He didn't stop hammering. "Trader out of the valley, comes up every spring." Mabel gripped the ladder. A cold knot formed in her stomach. The valley meant Oakhaven. Oakhaven meant Agatha, the town boys, the sneers, the suffocating shame she thought she had left behind. Emmett pulled back on the reins, halting his horse near the chopping block. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the mud and looked up at the roof. "Rough winter, Caleb," the trader called out. His voice was too loud, grating against the mountain quiet. "Lost 3 men down in the pass to avalanches. See you made it through." "I made it," Caleb replied. He drove a peg into a cedar shake. He didn't look down. Emmett's gaze slid from Caleb and landed squarely on Mabel. He looked her up and down, taking in her broad shoulders, her thick waist, the dirt on her face. A sleazy, knowing grin spread across his face, revealing rotted teeth. "Well, I'll be damned," Emmett chuckled. Agatha was bragging all winter she managed to fleece you, sold you the town's winter sow for $40. I figured you would have butchered her for meat by January." The silence that followed was absolute. Mabel's face burned. The old shame, sharp and familiar, rushed back into her throat. She looked down at her work-roughened hands, suddenly intensely aware of how much space she took up on the ladder. She waited for Caleb to agree. She waited for him to make a joke, to establish his dominance, to remind the trader that she was just a draft animal he had purchased out of desperation. Caleb slowly lowered his hammer. He didn't shout. He didn't scramble down the roof in a rage. He simply shifted his weight, looking down at the trader with eyes that held the cold, detached violence of a rock slide. "Her name is Mabel," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried effortlessly over the rushing creek. Emmett's grin faltered. "Now, Caleb, no offense meant. Just a joke from town." "I don't care about town," Caleb interrupted. He rested his mangled right hand on his knee. "She split the wood that kept me from freezing. She hauled the water. She tended my leg when the cold set in. She runs this claim as much as I do." Caleb stared unblinking at the trader. "So you will address her with respect, Emmett. Or you will turn that horse around and take your goods back down the mountain. And if you ever speak of her like livestock again, I'll make sure you don't make it past the timberline." Emmett swallowed hard. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Finally, the trader tipped his greasy hat. "My apologies, ma'am," Emmett mumbled, his eyes firmly fixed on his horse's ears. "I spoke out of turn." Mabel couldn't speak. Her chest was painfully tight. She just nodded once, her grip on the ladder turning her knuckles white. Caleb went back to hammering. The rest of the afternoon was spent trading pelts for flour, salt, and ammunition. Emmett didn't look at Mabel again, and as soon as the transaction was done, he rode out of the clearing as fast as the muddy trail allowed. That evening, the cabin was warm. The stove glowed dull red in the fading light. Mabel stood by the table, washing the supper plates. Caleb was sitting by the fire. He had a large bundle wrapped in canvas sitting across his lap. "Leave the plates," Caleb said. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron and turned around. Caleb stood up. He walked over to the table and set the canvas bundle down. He untied the rough twine and pulled the fabric back. Inside was a coat. It was made of thick, perfectly tanned elk hide, a rich, dark brown. The collar and cuffs were lined with soft, gray rabbit fur. Mabel reached out, running a calloused finger over the leather. It was incredibly soft, worked by hand until it was pliable. She looked closely at the stitching. It was tight, even, and deliberate. "I traded for the hide in the fall," Caleb said quietly. He didn't look at her. He looked at the coat. "Tanned it in the shed, sewed it during the nights you were asleep." Mabel stared at the garment. It wasn't a hand-me-down. It wasn't a man's coat that she was expected to just make do with. It was tailored. She could tell by the cut of the shoulders, the width of the back, the generous cut of the waist. He hadn't made a coat hoping she would shrink to fit it. He had spent hours, days, fighting the arthritis in his mangled hand to sew a garment that fit her exactly as she was. "Try it on," he murmured. Mabel slipped her arms into the sleeves. The heavy elk hide settled over her shoulders. The rabbit fur brushed against her neck. It fit perfectly. It didn't pinch her ribs. It didn't strain across her broad back. It felt like armor. She looked up at Caleb. His scarred face was soft in the lantern light. He wasn't a handsome man, and she wasn't a beautiful woman. They were two broken, discarded things that had found a way to survive the frost. "It fits," Caleb said, a faint trace of satisfaction in his rough voice. Mabel closed the distance between them. She didn't offer a flowery thank you. She didn't cry. She just reached out and wrapped her arms around his chest, resting her head against his shoulder. Caleb stiffened for a fraction of a second, entirely unaccustomed to the touch. Then slowly, his arms came up. His mangled right hand and his scarred left hand rested against the broad expanse of her back, holding her tight. He rested his chin on the top of her head. The wind howled outside, but inside the heavy log walls, there was only the quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts. Agatha had sold her for $40. But standing there in the warmth of the fire, Mabel knew the truth. She hadn't been sold into bondage. She had finally been bought out of it. The frontier was a harsh, unforgiving place that stripped away everything superficial, leaving only what was necessary to survive. Mabel and Caleb didn't build their bond on romance. They built it on mutual respect, split pine, and shared burdens. Sometimes the truest love is simply being seen for exactly who you are, and being chosen anyway. If this grounded, gritty mountain story hit home for you, drop a like, share the video, and subscribe for more untamed tales.